My name is John English. I'm co-chair of the Canadian International Council, and it's my great honor today to be here to present to you Edward Luce and Janice Stein, who will introduce him very soon. Before that, I'd like to recognize Bill McDonald and Dougal McDonald. We were introduced to Ed by Martin Wolfe, who was the first McDonald lecturer last year, and we appreciated that lecture so much, we decided to get someone else from the Financial Times. And the McDonald lecture this year will occur in the fall, and there will probably be an annual McDonald lecture honoring Bill McDonald, who has made such a large contribution to Canadian public life. And I also want to introduce Matthew Hughes, who is sitting over there. Matthew is the president of the World Affairs Councils of the United States, and he's reached out to us to establish a linkage, and we're going to have continuous meetings back and forth for the very obvious reason that Americans need to know Canada better, but perhaps Canadians need to know America better too. And we appreciate this initiative, and we look forward to Matthew's participation in our fall conference, and we think we'll have very useful discussions of our two nations and their mutual interests and their mutual disagreements, of course. And I want to recognize, of course, Joe Clark, former Prime Minister Joe Clark, who is the chair of our advisory board, which will be meeting tomorrow. Now I'd like to introduce Janice Stein. Janice Stein is a remarkable public figure herself, as well as a prominent academic, and she does her homework. I asked her to introduce Ed Luce, and she's read the entire book, and I've only got this far. And that's typical of Janice. She's the Cinderella of this campus. She was the founder of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and she is now the interim director of the Munk School. They can't find anyone to fill her shoes on a lasting basis. She's done a wonderful job. The Munk School has become a preeminent school of public policy and global affairs, and so much of the credit for that truly remarkable accomplishment is Janice Stein. Janice?
Thank you so much, John. Let me join in welcoming Prime Minister Joe Clark. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and there are so many others in the room. I see Peter at the back, but there are so many others in the room that are reliably interested in serious conversation about world affairs. So it's a pleasure really to have you all here. Now this is, when John asked me to do this is a particular pleasure for me. First of all, I have read almost all, but not all, but almost all. I'm getting to the very last two chapters, but let me tell you all, this is a real treat, this book. It is, as Ed always does, beautifully written, which is a dying art. I can tell you not one paragraph was written by AI in that book. You can tell by the language and the pacing, it's just beautifully written. And it's about a fascinating person, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, some of you will know that he was born in Montreal because his parents, his father was the Consul General of the Free Polish government in Montreal. And after the war, his father defected to Canada, but Zbigniew Brzezinski grew up in my hometown. And I knew him, as I said to Ed, and we often talked about Canada. And there is a myth, let me put it this way, that he held Canada in disregard. In disregard, Joe. That is not accurate, but he did feel repeatedly, and he said it in private, that Canada was an underperformer. I heard a comment there. I can understand an advisor to the US president making that comment, but as I just said to Ed, any rational Canadian decision maker would have understood that we benefited from our relationship in the US umbrella almost no matter what we did, at least until the current administration. And that is an entirely new discussion, which I know will come up this afternoon. Brzezinski was, I can say it, look at the color of my hair, of the old school. He studied, he read, he traveled. There was nothing superficial about him. He had very strong views about the world. And many of them it was interesting when you tried to put them together. He was deeply in his DNA anti-communist, which came from his father's experience. And he had what I can only describe as an abiding hatred of the Soviet Union and the Soviet government, not of Russia, which he had great respect for its culture and its traditions, but he had a deep hatred of the Soviet Union. But as soon as you unmoored him from that subject, he looked out at the world. He worked as President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He looked out at the world with an amazingly surgical mind when he thought about big challenges. He was an academic. So, of course, we always have a soft spot. He taught at Columbia for years. He taught my twin sister when she was a graduate student at Columbia, as well as my brother-in-law. And he was remarkably committed to his students, which, again, to me, ranks very high on my list of priorities. He was a remarkable supervisor. He actually read drafts of his students' dissertations. So I would say, whatever you think about Zbigniew Brzezinski, he was a serious person. And the book is an absolute delight about a very serious figure. So don't leave the monk school without buying a copy of this book on your way out of the room tonight, all right? It's a treat and an honor for us to have Ed Luce at the monk school. You're described, Ed, as the chief Washington commentator. What's the difference between a chief Washington commentator and a chief Washington correspondent?
Columns, editorials.
Columns and editorials.
Not a reporter anymore.
Not a reporter anymore, okay. For that estimable newspaper, the Financial Times, which is still one of my favorite reads. It maintains its quality. Ed has been all over the world. He was the South Asia bureau chief, and that's where you wrote that wonderful book. If you haven't read it, it's called In Spite of the Gods, which is an absolutely wonderful book about contemporary India. And then in a fairly prophetic book, I think, before others, and listen to the title and you'll know why I say this. It's called The Retreat of Modern Liberalism. And that was published in what year?
2017.
2017, just 1 year into the first term of Donald Trump's first presidency, and Ed had a sense of where we were going. So it is with great pleasure that I invite Ed to the podium, and I can tell you we're all in for a treat.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction to which I couldn't possibly do justice. But I must warn you, I've got a strong coffee that I demanded when I came in because I was up late last night, as journalists in Washington tend to be, even on holiday weekends. It's Memorial Day weekend. So the coffee has restored me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Prime Minister Donald, it's an immense pleasure to be here, as it always is to be in Canada. I've been all over Canada. Vancouver many times, Edmonton, Halifax, obviously Montreal and Toronto. But the title I've sort of given to this is Trump and the Revenge of Geopolitics. But as you've just been hearing, people who write books, which I just have, and particularly biographies, which I just have of Zbigniew Brzezinski, tend to get a little bit monomaniacal. And one of the sort of great features of Brzezinski's life in the 1970s, in the era of geopolitics, the Cold War geopolitical era, was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, which Kissinger and Nixon negotiated. And the Carter administration was riven between Cy Vance and Brzezinski over whether SALT II, which was the next generation Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, should be the overriding priority. Brzezinski thought it shouldn't, Vance thought it should. And my wife, who's been, making jokes about how there are three of us in this marriage, me, her, and Brzezinski, says that when she asks me to pass the salt, I say SALT I or SALT II. That's how obsessional I've become. But I did want to, this is not going to be a talk about Brzezinski, but I did want to start with him, because the revenge of geopolitics implies there was an original geopolitics, and certainly the original modern era geopolitics, as many of you will recall, was during the Cold War, and probably the most turbulent decade of the Cold War was the 1970s. It was the decade of Kissinger. It was also the decade of Brzezinski. And the stand-up battles between these two sort of grand strategists really did dominate foreign policy debate, and shifts through that decade, also in the late 60s and then into the Reagan 80s. But it was when you get, as I did, the diaries that were given to me by Brzezinski's family that he kept as National Security Advisor. So he'd speak in the half-an-hour journey from the White House to his home in McLean, Virginia. He'd speak into a dictaphone in these perfectly formed paragraphs every night for about half an hour on that journey. And it's printed up, it's Tolstoyan in length. It's just the enormous first draft of history. I had absolutely no intention of doing a biography, because biographies you do properly or not at all. And as John can attest, doing them properly, really is a serious endeavor, particularly combined with a day job. But when I started reading these diaries, I got hooked, and then managed to get tons of other material, the private correspondence in Polish between the Pope, John Paul II, and Brzezinski, the secret police files the Polish and the Soviets kept on Brzezinski for his trips over there, the childhood diaries that he wrote in Polish. Suddenly it all becomes very sort of cinematic. And just one sort of tiny thing before I get back to Trump and the revenge of geopolitics, is that Kissinger-Brzezinski relationship, which is really legendary and spans decades, begins with a little bit of poetic license in 1938, because 3 weeks before the notorious, infamous Munich summit between Chamberlain, Hitler, and others, Heinz Kissinger arrives in New York as a refugee from Nazi Germany, 15-year-old Heinz Kissinger, and a few days after the Munich agreement, a 10-year-old Zbigniew Brzezinski, son of a Polish diplomat who'd got himself posted as consul general to Montreal, also steams into New York Harbor, gets his first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty, and then takes the train to Montreal. And the last time they met, they didn't actually meet then, but there's a little bit of a sort of poetic brushing. It was 2016, December, in Oslo, where the Nobel Peace Committee gave a kind of Lifetime Achievement Award to Brzezinski, and to Brzezinski's great annoyance, they invited Kissinger to be on stage with him. And that was Brzezinski's last trip abroad. So these two great geostrategists of the Cold War, there are others. George Kennan is obviously the father of Cold War strategic thinking. But these two lived in the 1970s, and these diaries really dominated the 70s. These diaries were as geopolitical as you get. You have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You have the Soviet non-invasion of Poland, which Brzezinski's relationship with this Pope that fortune had decreed to be the first non-Italian in 453 years, a Pole like Brzezinski, and he had P for Pope on his White House phone. There was a Vatican hotline. The Soviet non-invasion of Poland very nearly happened, the Iranian hostage crisis, the Camp David peace talks that produced the first Arab recognition of Israel by an Arab country, Egypt, of course, the return of the Panama Canal to Panamanian sovereignty, an extraordinary act of political enlightenment by Carter, simply to do the right thing. Brzezinski had slightly different motives. His was, we need to end the Monroe Doctrine, because we cannot allow the Soviets to have their own sphere of interest, or contest their sphere of interest if we don't have one, unless we renounce ours. And so on. This was a very geopolitical era. So fast forward to the end of the Cold War, and you have, very understandably, a period of triumphalism in the West, particularly in Washington, D.C., that our system had prevailed, mostly peacefully. This Cold War had been ended on our terms. And you have a great deal of, I think, hubris also about the fact that our model is the one that succeeded. And Brzezinski wrote this book that really jarred with that triumphalist spirit, called Out of Control, which he brought out in 1993, in which he said that the losers of this Cold War, the perceived losers of this grand 1989 hinge moment in history, would gradually sort of coalesce with each other. China and Russia, this time with China as the big brother, Russia as the little brother, Iran, North Korea, and others, in which he called the alliance of the aggrieved. And remember, this is 1993. Now, I've been very fortunate, for some reason, in the last couple of weeks, to tiptoe onto the bottom end of the New York Times bestsellers list, which, is something that's always a great thrill. Out of Control by Brzezinski did not get onto the bestsellers list. Nobody wanted to hear this. The End of History by Fukuyama was on the bestsellers list. And so he was a strategic mind that was out of kilter with this very astrategic moment of sort of self-standing ovation that we in the West were giving ourselves. And I mention this because that decade, the 90s, really up till, you can date, I guess, the return of geopolitics to 9/11, but that sort of 12-year period of what the French called hyperpuissance, of the unipolarity of America, was a flip from what we'd seen going before and what we'd seen happening before, whether you're talking about Kissinger, Brzezinski, or many others, is an America that studied its adversaries, that really got to know them intimately. I mean, Kissinger obviously spoke many languages. Brzezinski spoke many languages. He literally read Pravda with his morning coffee. It wasn't that day's Pravda, but he read Pravda in the morning. You had the post-Cold War university, the post-war Cold War university that sort of sprung up, mushroomed up from nothing to really a huge thing by the late 1940s, was driven by a thirst for knowledge, public-private partnership, huge funding from the state, but also a drive for expertise wherever it came from, which of course is the ideal circumstances for luminaries, immigrant scholars, such as Brzezinski, Kissinger, and many others, particularly the nuclear scientists, but for these people to flourish and to thrive. And what we got in the 90s was an inversion of that, which is, well, we have been studying the world so as to learn strategy, so as to be strategic-minded in our interactions with our adversaries, with our longer-term foreign policy goals, to a situation in the 90s where essentially not in the universities, but in Washington, the line was, well, now it's your turn to study us. We are at the top of the ladder, and our job is to help you up rungs of this ladder, is to help you to become more like us, because we have reached a sort of ideal state. And in economics, this was the Washington Consensus. And in geopolitics, it was essentially the end of geopolitics. It was, well, there'll be some problems here and there, but essentially the big arguments have been settled. And in politics, of course, it was the sort of gradual spread of democracy, the dawning of, and all three of these precepts, if you think of it as a stool, all three of these legs have been knocked out. Clearly, the Washington Consensus is discredited and repudiated by Washington, not just on Liberation Day, on April the 2nd. Clearly, geopolitics is back. And I say since 9/11, but I don't think it ever went away. But clearly, we're aware that it now never went away. And clearly, democracy is undergoing what Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession. We're in a world where 72% of people live in autocracies, but of the remaining 28%, lots of them are in illiberal democracies, which are in the wrong direction of travel. So you will have noticed I haven't actually mentioned Trump yet, except at the beginning, because I believe the preconditions for all of this do predate Donald Trump's first election in 2016, Trump 1.0. I think that he is partly a product of this world, but I think he's also an accelerant. So maybe 10 years ago we could have had a discussion about the return of geopolitics. Trump makes it the revenge of geopolitics. You might wonder, I'm sure you're all as obsessed with what's going on in Washington as people like me who are paid to be obsessed. I'd do it for free, frankly. It's gripping. But I'd need to pay the bills somehow. But so let's not sort of explore that analogy. But it is utterly gripping, sometimes in a sickly gripping sense that I cannot believe that the president of South Africa is being treated like this, etc. That kind of moment, viscera kind of moment. But it's also intellectually gripping, because the larger context, the return of geopolitics, is something that we are going to be living with indefinitely after Trump's gone. I think Trump will leave a very deep accelerant on this trend, and I think he will go not quietly whenever he goes, and so that's a whole nother discussion. But the broader context of the return of geopolitics is a fact of life that I think we have to live with. Now, I want to say a couple of things about Trump, about how you handle Trump, and nobody's an expert in that, but let me give you my thoughts for what they're worth, and then something more generally about the sea we're swimming in now, because this is the sea we're going to be swimming in indefinitely. This is not an aberration. So how you handle Trump? Well, look, your prime minister has done a pretty good job. I think, if you sort of measure people by being firm but without being provocative, being sure in what their message is without being performative, I think Mark Carney's actually a pretty good role model for how you do it. I think I perhaps give slightly lower grades to Keir Starmer of Britain, who seemed to bend the knee a little bit too quickly, but for understandable reasons. And Britain and the UK-US deal is still the only deal. It's really a framework of agreement with lots of blank placeholder things. But I understand why the British government breathed a sigh of relief after it was initialed. Even though it leaves Britain 10% worse off in terms of trade with the US, it's not like we're going back to the base. The new baseline is 10%. That's a victory. And America is the surplus country in this relationship. China, of course, is the other end of the spectrum. China has hung tough. The EU is somewhere in between. The Gulf, of course, is like reinventing grift on a scale with zeros that we haven't quite seen the scale of, at least in terms of the numbers we're hearing. Most of them probably won't transpire. But as, you know, I think anybody who's observed Trump or knows Trump can attest, gratitude doesn't last long with Trump. I mean, the famous story about Roy Cohn back in the 70s and the 80s, who really made Trump, the famous New York lawyer, the McCarthyite lawyer, who made Trump, and perhaps made him in more than one sense, was dying of AIDS in the mid-80s in a New York hospital. Trump didn't even bother to visit him, and he said he pisses ice. So Trump does not have gratitude, and yet it's obviously wrong unless you're, and perhaps unless you're China or unless you're Putin, maybe. It's obviously wrong to provoke him. What you do is an analogy that I've never lost, but from the first time, is you bring fruits to the volcano. You bring fruits to the volcano, and you hope this pacifies, keeps it dormant for a while, but it's not going to last for very long. The single force that we have observed in this second iteration of Trump, 155 days, whatever it is we've now gone through, that can stop Trump, or at least cause him to rethink, is the Treasury bond market. That is really the only force that will cause him to back down, at least for a while. The Treasury bond market stands alone. The media, we're doing our best. Private sector is hiding under a rock. Most law firms are hiding under a rock. Harvard is not been joined by collective action of other universities, in spite of the fact that we've seen what happened to Columbia, which submitted completely and got nothing for it. And I do think there's when I first turned up in North America 20 years, well, not first, but this stint, I've been here for 20 years. And I share something in common with Brzezinski and Kissinger. It sounds like I just arrived, but I really didn't. I've been here 20 years. The advice was, when I was going hiking in Appalachia and you saw a bear, the advice was to make yourself look bigger than you are, and to be very conspicuous. And I think this sort of really applies. It really applies to Trump. If you look like prey, if you dress like an antelope and you walk like an antelope, he will eat you. And so you have to have a sort of a line between not looking like prey, but also not being uselessly provocative. And I think Mark Carney has done a pretty good job on that. And as I say, I think the bond markets are the only serious, consistent check we have yet seen on Trump's actions. The two pauses he's done, the Liberation Day pause 10 days later, and then most recently the pause that he announced yesterday after escalating EU tariffs up to 50% and the 25% on iPhone. These resulted in the dollar falling, but also Treasury bond yields rising, which is not normally how it happens, right? They normally go in opposite directions. Bond prices do not fall with the dollar. Rising yields make Treasury bonds more desirable, but there's clearly a new premium, what some people in Britain after the Liz Truss, short-lived Liz Truss government call the moron premium. It means US debt is going to be more expensive. So the geopolitical world that we're living with now is multipolar, and what the Cold War was bipolar. And that was complicated and dangerous enough. But to the most part, Democrats and Republicans, the American foreign policy establishment, understood who the adversary was and where they were. They were in Moscow. They were the Soviet Union. They sponsored, at least formally, and in reality for many decades, worldwide regime change and revolution. They were there in the Horn of Africa. They were there in Central America. They were there in Afghanistan. So there was some clarity. Politics didn't completely stop at the water's edge during the Cold War. There was the McCarthyite era. There was in the 70s, in reaction to Vietnam, the McGovernite sort of reaction against conventional foreign policy. There was the Berkeley sort of protests against this. But broadly speaking, there was an understanding of who the adversary was and that you needed to get to know that adversary well. Well, now we live in a multipolar world, which is more complicated and inherently more unstable. It's a much, much more volatile and less easily forecastable world. There is no sort of single summit between two leaders that is going to stabilize things. It's got to be much more complicated, and therefore our knowledge of it, our immersion in the subject matter, our ability to sleep, breathe the languages of those who are on different poles in this world is that much more important. It's that much more important. I mean, I think Canada and others are learning this lesson. This is a teachable moment if you want to put a silver lining on it. But there isn't consensus between Democrats and Republicans about which of these poles present the real challenges. I think there's particularly no consensus on Russia. There is some degree of consensus on China, but I think there's no consensus on Russia, and I suspect that that's going to paralyze American strategic action for the foreseeable future. If you are a company, and I mean, we're at the Monk School, I mean, we're Toronto's a business city, but if you're a company, this geopolitical dimension to life has gone from being what you might do on your annual retreat, on your off-site. Once a year, you'll invite in a speaker, and you will all sort of think about, the rise of Asia and what it does, and the UN and stuff like that, to becoming something that's integrated in the constant real-time risk model. I mean, the original company that set up a political futures unit is Shell in the early 1970s, and it was unique. Oil and gas did it. And they did it because they were investing in places like Nigerian Delta. They needed to know who controlled the power and what might happen. Now, if you run a dog food company, you need to be doing this. These things that we used to think of as black swans are gray swans. They're much more predictable. I don't know whether it's the Houthis interrupting oil supply, or maybe there's something that runs aground and just hits the supply chain in the Suez Canal, or there is some cyber attack. These things are forecastable. They're predictable, regardless of whether Trump is in the White House or not. And so this revenge of geopolitics is a normal feature of the lives I think we're going to be living, and that applies at all levels, corporate as well as for diplomats and scholars and strategic brains like Brzezinski and Kissinger. One of the sort of wonderful things about doing a biography is it's basically the closest that fiction gets to, the narrative art of nonfiction gets to fiction. It's the most novelistic writing form. So as a writer, you can really give rein to your writing, as long as you're deeply immersed in the research and the material. And the thing that taught me that researching Brzezinski and therefore all his rivals, because it's all relevant to biography, and not just his Sovietology, but the Sovietology of people who disagreed with him and other schools of Sovietology. As John can attest as a biographer, there is no real natural limit to the context you provide in a biography. But the thing I really extracted from this remarkable life that began in Warsaw in 1928 and ended in the first few months in May 2017, 3 months after Trump had first come to power. The thing that I really extracted from it was that a strategic brain might disagree with what Brzezinski did. For a while in Montreal, he was known as Darth Vader. During the 70s, he was really hated on the left. He then became a hero of the left after 9/11, opposed the Iraq War. I think came in very early and very trenchantly, partly out of guilt for having not realized early enough that the Vietnam War was a mistake. He stuck around supporting it till 67. But he went from being this sort of bête noire of the left to being this hero of the left. Or whether you're on the Kissinger side, or whichever sort of perspective you have, is that immersion in your subject matter and every sphere of it, not just the minutes of the Politburo, say you're Brzezinski and it's the Cold War, but testing it by traveling around the country and testing it against reality. Curiosity, reading, going to sports games, going to plays that aren't political, traveling to Odessa and arguing with people on the seafront, whatever it might be, appetite, knowledge, is the absolute sort of, and omnivorous knowledge is the absolute key, I think, to being any kind of strategic brain. It is not a specialism. No single brain can hope to be a specialist in geopolitics because you're talking about the whole world acting and interacting. How could you possibly be a specialist in that, in reality? All you can be is a relentless quester after more insight and more knowledge. And he made a lot of mistakes. I didn't go into the Iran hostage crisis. So did I take too much coffee? Yes, I did. Sorry. I've talked longer than I thought. He made a lot of mistakes. And he did some things right. And it was at McGill, and I'll end on this point, his MA thesis at McGill in 1950, he wrote a paper, 100-page paper, called Russo-Soviet Nationalism. And he's 22, but he's learned fluent Russian, and so he's reading all this stuff. And the kernel of this thesis is what he kept with him right up till 1989, through the big Sovietological debates at Harvard in the 50s, Columbia in the 60s, and then as LBJ, junior person in LBJ's administration, foreign director of Hubert Humphrey's ill-fated 1968 campaign where he lost to Nixon, through the 70s, through Carter, through Reagan, who twice offered Brzezinski to be his national security advisor. This McGill thesis contains the absolute sort of core of his strategy. And the thesis is that there are all these nations in the Warsaw Pact, but also within the USSR, the Kazakhs, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, who do not feel like they are Soviet citizens. They are Kazakhs, Georgians, Ukrainians, who realize they're in a Russian empire dressed up in Marxist clothing. And the more we realize, that was this very arrogant young man's point, the more we can actually weaponize this feeling of suppressed nationalisms and try and unlock it and help unravel the Soviet Union. And he refined this a bit, but he basically stuck with this thesis. And the entire point of it was we need knowledge of what's happening behind the Iron Curtain. Because Sovietology was, no, it's a monolith, they're Soviets. Let's deal with what Kennan has given us, which is we'll contain them, but we're not really that interested in what goes on inside, behind the Iron Curtain. That was based on knowledge, wounded Polishness, the whole sort of sense of Polish romantic anger at what had happened to them in the Second World War and before, but also just this relentless quest, which is what goes up to making a strategic brain. And if, I don't need to make the point, but we don't value strategic brains in Washington anymore, and we really need them. So I imagine there'll be some disagreements on questions or whatever, and therefore I don't need to flesh out that concluding point. But that's the essence of what I wanted to say to you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the coffee. Oh, sorry.
Take questions. Do we have microphones as well? Here, and then I'll go over there.
Should I stand here? Yeah.
Whatever.
Thanks for your lecture. You mentioned Henry Kissinger, and this might be sort of more of a niche question, but could you maybe elaborate to the extent that you can on the nature of, I know they were friends, and Brzezinski hired Samuel Huntington, so I'm wondering what was the nature of their friendship and their relationship, and how they developed each other's thoughts, if they did, and influenced each other's sort of strategic development, because they were both far-thinking thinkers in a way and strategists, but they were also often accused of being erratic and sort of off-site a bit at times. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
So is that about the Kissinger, Brzezinski, or Huntington Kissinger? Huntington Brzezinski. Yeah. So 1954, a young Zbig and a young Huntington went out on a double date. And Huntington's date was a woman called Emily Benez, who then became Brzezinski's wife. And up to that point, his diaries had been full of this girl, that girl, quite sort of cringe-making. There was necking or kissing. So it's not just Sovietology, the research I've been doing. This is a full life biography. And after that, no mention. And Huntington, I think, made the joke that Brzezinski was very uncollegiate that evening. And so this became, Muska, as Emily Benez became, who was known, her nickname was his lifelong wife. She was incidentally the grandniece of Edward Benez, the last leader of Czechoslovakia, both when it was snuffed out after the Munich Agreement, but also he came back after the Second World War, and it was then, of course, snuffed out by the Soviets, so twice. But Huntington was known in the National Security Council. Brzezinski brought him in. He was known as Zbig because he was the sort of strategic planner that Brzezinski brought him in to do. And his chief job was to do a net assessment of Soviet and US power. And the context for this is détente is coming to an end, détente being Kissinger's real thing. It's beginning to really wane. Brzezinski's become more and more of a critic of it. He wants to weaponize Helsinki. He wants to weaponize the human rights provision, the third basket of Helsinki, and stimulate civic action, freedom, protests for freedom of religion, of expression, of movement, etc., behind the Iron Curtain. Kissinger really doesn't want any of this. And there has been a sense from Kissinger, who is sort of Spenglerian in his pessimism. He believes the Soviet Union is catching up, as it had by that point in nuclear weapons. He believes that the Soviets, he's still got the Sputnik idea in his head. And what Huntington does is demonstrate very clearly there's only one area where the Soviets even begin to compete, and that is nuclear weapons technology. On everything else, they're being left in the dust. And it's remarkable that it took really till the late 1970s for the United States to acknowledge that whole Sputnik thing, that was really a flash in the pan, except in terms of military technology. The Soviets were, I think Brzezinski described it as a museum to the industrial age, the Soviet economy. So Huntington wrote this very comprehensive net assessment, and it was a multiple interagency and took 18 months, but it was a pretty definitive document. And it is the sort of basis for the actions Carter took, the modernization of nuclear weapons, wiping out the gap that had developed during détente, and a number of other things. So, I guess it's no accident Reagan offered Brzezinski the job, sort of half-heartedly, but he offered him twice. Brzezinski wasn't interested, but because the predicates for Reaganism were laid under Carter, in sort of the same way that the anti-inflation stuff and the deregulation of industries happened under Carter. But history has to give it to one president or the other. It's a bit more complicated. But Huntington was a very key person in Brzezinski's National Security Council, and that was far too long an answer. I'm very sorry.
Thank you. Your optimism is overwhelming. Thank you for that. I suspect you know a great deal about the Office of National Security Advisor, the nuances, what is entailed. What would you suggest an effective national security advisor would deal with mob boss posing as POTUS in terms of being integrity, ethical, and yet speaking truth to power without blowing up the house? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I mean, you probably heard the joke that when Kissinger is the only person till now who was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and that was the only time those two roles have ever got along with each other. That was one of Kissinger's great jokes. Well, now Rubio has both of them, so one hopes that Rubio's getting along with himself, but it really wouldn't matter because the reason he's got both those positions, the reason Mike Waltz was sent to Siberia to become UN ambassador is because Waltz had differing opinions to Trump on Russia. He did believe that Trump should follow through his threats and impose sanctions on Russia, and he was a lot more aggressive than Trump on Iran. It was the sort of nature of their dispute doesn't really matter. What matters is to be a national security advisor to Trump or any position serving Trump. You need to be ultra loyal. You need to, and a yes man cannot be a strategist.
Mr. Luce, well, firstly, thank you for the FT contributions. One of my great delights in the morning when I read the papers.
Thank you.
Secondly, I'm sorry, a Trump question. Trump exposed and used a darkness in America. I think there's little doubt about that. Trump will go away, but will the darkness go away?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I've always seen Trump as a symptom of a deeper disease, but a cure far worse than the disease. And so when I, observe the Democratic Party and talk to Democratic, operatives and senators and stuff, and when I get the sense that their strategy is wait till 2026, wait till the midterms, and then wait till 2028, I get a little bit nervous because they're not going to be stepping into the same river twice. The effect that Trump has had in 155 days, I think it matches the impact of his first 4 years. This is way more dramatic, way more intense. And why wouldn't it be? I mean, the guy stormed Capitol Hill. He tried to overthrow an election. He had multiple criminal cases against him. And indictments, and he was re-elected president. There's that sort of awful old Russian phrase, it's like a dog going back to its vomit. But I don't think it's an inappropriate analogy to use in this context. America confirmed it wanted Trump. Now it's very divided, evenly divided America. This was not a landslide. This was not some resounding mandate. But it wasn't an accident either. And so if your question is this sort of some Trump understudy like Vance or maybe Rubio or Donald Jr. who could replace Trump? No, I don't think so. And I think Trump has this sort of unique cult leader kind of qualities that are usually irreplaceable. It's very, very rare a cult sort of has a number two who has a seamless transition of power. But on the other hand, the maladies that led to Trumpism, of which I think plutocracy is a major part, and that sort of weird combination of class and race, and that sort of chemical interaction in America. The maladies are there. Trump is making them dramatically worse. And if there's one sort of expertise that people who are otherwise manifestly unqualified for positions across this administration, there are some who are qualified, like Rubio, but are acting unqualified. But there are many people who have absolutely no credentials for the jobs they've been put in, particularly at the second and third tiers. The one expertise all these people have, where they've come to Trump's notice, is in disinformation. It's in finding scapegoats when things go wrong. So the idea that this economy will sort of dwindle a bit and people will feel the pinch, there'll be higher inflation, lower incomes, they will therefore throw the bums out. I think that might happen, particularly in the midterms, but in a presidential election, who knows? I mean, there are. It's just very rash to predict anything at the moment, but I don't think the underlying causes of Trumpism are that easily wished away.
I'm told we have time for one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry, my answers are too long. Apologies.
I'd like to ask you about the observations you made about the mood of hubris in the wake of the end of the Cold War. There are two related aspects of that mood that I'd like you to comment on. One of them is the quite extravagant utopian optimism, which is actually very similar to the sort of optimism that came after victory in both world wars. The second is the thinness of the conception of human nature, human motivation, that was quite prevalent. The assumption that because we were converging economically, we'd converge politically and culturally and socially. And whenever I talk to my students about the thinness of that interpretation, I point to a review George Orwell did in 1940 of a translation of Mein Kampf. And he said both capitalism and socialism offer people a high standard of living and a good time. Hitler offers them blood, death, and sacrifice, and a nation flings itself at his feet. And those sentiments seem to have been completely neglected in the analyses that prevailed in 1989.
That's a really good question. I mean, I did quite a few interviews with Kissinger for this biography. Before he died, obviously before he died. It would have been pretty odd. And I got to know Brzezinski pretty well in the last 12 years of his life, because I moved to DC in 2006, moved back to DC in 2006. He died in 2017, 11 years of his life. And one of the things that Kissinger stressed, I did ask him, I mean, talk of Kissingerisms, I said, so where would you rank Brzezinski in terms of Cold War strategists? And he said, I'd certainly put him in the top 2. But one of the things he stressed in these interviews, and Brzezinski did in different ways, and I did not know I was going to be Brzezinski's biographer when he was alive, was that they both brought with them, whatever the sort of gulf between them in terms of strategy, that they both brought with them an understanding of the tragic, the thinness of civilization, how quickly societies could break up, and that though they were both exceptionists in the sense that America was the best hope of mankind for the Second World War and the Cold War, they were not exceptionists in that higher sort of providential sense, that America is somehow suspended from the laws of history, just doesn't really need to pay. I mean, God is on its side, essentially. And I think that was a sort of really key element of what people like them, coming from interwar, interbellum Europe, the bloodlands of Central Europe, that sense of the tragic, of the fragility of things, was a very important sort of factor, that is hard for anybody today, in the West to really have direct experience of. But maybe, I've been teaching for the last year at one of the universities in America, I get a sense they're a lot flintier 20, 21-year-olds today, because they sort of were 12 when Trump came in. They're much less starry-eyed, and maybe their teachable moment will produce a slightly grittier mindset. Not bloodlands of interwar Europe. We don't want this moment to be too teachable. But I sense that there's a lot more interest in the sort of nitty-gritty empiricism of things. How does the world work? How could it go wrong? Than I would have experienced with students 10 years ago. So I'm trying to find a silver lining. Sorry, I know I've been bringing out your suicidal urges today, but I'm trying. That to me is actually quite a significant silver lining, and probably a realistic one. But anyway, great question, and sorry that my answers have been too long to everybody's questions. Is there time for one more? No. No. All right.
But thank you very much for
Thank
this.
you.
It was really I'm Nicolas Rouleau. I'm the other co-chair of the CIC. We find that with two co-chairs, you can just bookend the meetings. It's a lot easier. And it's my pleasure to introduce the Right Honorable Joe Clark to come and thank Mr. Luce. I say introduce, but I don't think the man needs any introduction. But maybe for the two of you who have been living under a rock for the last 50 years, he is the former Prime Minister, former Minister of Foreign Affairs as well, and I think everybody would agree that he's one of the most consequential, important foreign affairs ministers we've had, also one of the most compassionate ones. And a lot of the themes that we saw in the 80s, refugees, apartheid, are still with us today. And so I think we could take some direction from his leadership, and hopefully Minister Anand is listening as well. Also, from a closer perspective, he happens to be the co-chair, or the chair, sorry. He didn't need a co-chair, as with John and I, but the chair of the advisory board of the CIC, and we've really benefited from his wisdom. So I would ask him to please come up.
Well, if you write as well as you speak, your book will be a bestseller, and we learned a lot from it, although you raised more questions than answers, which I think is the purpose of public dialogue and public speeches. I want to make two comments, one about, if I may, you, the United States, one about us. And about you, I am alarmed to think that you, being the United States, I'm alarmed to think that the kinds of almost brutality that we're seeing from the president now will not elicit a significant response over time among Americans. I don't know that. There have been some intriguing little instances of advice. A small town in British Columbia, alarmed at what was being said by your president about our country, issued an invitation, knowing no one down there, to come and visit their little community in the off the west coast of Canada, and 300 or 400 people showed up. Some of them who'd never been there before, who had no connections with Canada, but who were attracted by this alternative view, and so they came. It would be truly alarming if President Trump can get away with the kind of treatment of, on the one hand, his allies, but on the other hand, his public responsibilities, without some kind of response from the United States. And I may be misinterpreting your assessment, but you sound pessimistic about the possibility of some kind of rollback. And about us, I had the privilege to be foreign minister for nearly 7 years in Canada, a fairly long time. And we were proud of a number of things we did, and we were by and large satisfied with the way we got along with your government. But it is true that we were careful. And we were careful, among other things, in that while we took initiatives we thought were significant on a lot of issues in the world, we quite deliberately did not seek to disagree with the United States administration. When an issue arose and we had different views, we established that. And I was listening to you, I was thinking that there are some reasons that the government of which I was a part gave such attention to refugees, to international affairs. There were reasons why we gave such attention to the question of apartheid, because those were issues where we knew we could pursue issues in which we believed without exciting any significantly dangerous reaction from the United States. Now, that was not the guiding factor of all of our foreign policy, but I have to admit, in retrospect, it was in the back of our minds. Which brings us to the recent polite disagreement between the present Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States. Because as I understand what Prime Minister Carney is saying, is that in an important sense, some of those old days are over in the Canada-US relationship, and that it is now time for us to take a look at areas where our interest in getting along with a powerful and difficult neighbor does not drive us away, does not lead us away from taking positions that we feel we're going to need to have. And as I interpret what he says, and it was a statement of intent that he's not had time to demonstrate to this stage, I think that there is a possibility for a more active, not response to Trump directly, but a more active determination to take initiatives that earlier Canadian governments may not have taken in the world, simply because the threats that the president poses are so much more serious to us and to others than was the case before. We have a lot of thinking to do about that, but the purpose of excellent universities and meetings like this is to have that thinking stimulated. And I simply want to very sincerely thank you for the way in which you have stimulated our thinking, our sense not only of what we observe, but our sense of what we may be able to do, which is quite important to us, I think, at this space and time. So thank you very much.
Quick public service announcement. Please join us outside for a reception. Mr. Luce's book is for sale. You can get it signed. Please, please, please purchase it. Also, please, 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 for those of you who aren't members, become members of the CIC. And for those of you who are members, consider donating. That's what allows us to keep these events free. There's lots of other Financial Times columnists we want to bring, so we'll be able to have more of these events. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.